Hey guys, Channel MST here. Today I'm going to be going over priority, which will include turn priority, passing priority, and retaining a priority, and I'll also give a few examples. So to start off, cards do not have priority, players do, and a player can retain priority in each phase of their turn, and also a player gets priority when events happen. So during their turn, if I summon a monster, if I attack, those sorts of things. This is mostly seen, however, when a player summons a monster and tells the other player that they call priority with their monster's effect, for example. Some players don't really care that much about knowing the details of priority, and/or they just want to know the basics. However, if you know the mechanics of priority, it can actually mean the difference between winning and losing a game. Okay, so I'm going to continue by going through examples because it's one thing to talk about, but it's a whole different thing if I can show you the specifics by going through different scenarios. I'm going to talk about the difference between when you summon a monster and you can call priority versus when a monster is summoned and their effect triggers. So for example, Blackluster Soldier, his effect you can call priority with, because this effect here does not say when it's summoned, so it doesn't have to be activated when he's summoned. The same with Rescue Rabbit, you can activate this at any time during your main phase 1 or 2. Moving on, we have Caius. This card says when this card is tribute summoned, do this. Therefore, this is a trigger effect that happens when he's summoned. So when you summon him, you do not call priority. You say, I summon Caius, effect trigger, and then you go from there. The same with Breaker the Magical Warrior. When this card is normal summoned, you place 1 counter on it, so this effect triggers when he is summoned. The same with Tour Guide from the Underworld. When she's normal summoned, you can special summon. This effect happens when this card is summoned. You can't just summon it and then later say, okay, activate the effect. This happens specifically when it is summoned. And this is important because of cards like this. When, I can't pull in the rug your Rescue Rabbit. However, I can pull in the rug your Tour Guide, or your Caius, or your Breaker, or your Gadget, for that matter. Also, I cannot swallow flip your Blackluster Soldier. However, I can swallow flip Trishula, Dragon of Ice Barrier. Okay, so moving on. So Trishula, this effect is a trigger effect that happens when it's summoned. And whereas Brionac is not a trigger effect, this is the effect that when it's synchro summoned or summoned from your extra deck, you just call priority with it. Same with Scrap Dragon. Sometimes they'll say like once per turn you can do this, and that's usually a good indicator that this is something you can call priority with. And then these are also effects that will happen when a monster is synchro summoned or a monster is summoned. These kind of effects right here, these are trigger effects that will actually remove priority. So for example, if my opponent has TG Hyper Librarian, I have Caius or Blackluster Soldier, something really big basically, and my opponent has some tokens and they have Spore, for example, and they synchro summon into Brionac, I can actually go, TG Hyper Librarian's effect will activate, and I can chain Bottomless Trap Hole to the effect of TG Hyper Librarian to remove Brionac from the field, and my opponent could say, oh, well, I'm going to call priority, and they discard a card and they say, I'm going to remove your Caius, and I can say, no, you don't get priority, because priority is a player's ability to activate something before their opponent gets a chance to. So this kind of card actually gets rid of priority because this is something that actually is on the field already and responds directly to an event that happened. So if, for example, I were to summon Rescue Rabbit and my opponent had King Tiger Wangu on the board, King Tiger Wangu's effect would trigger and I would not be able to use Rescue Rabbit's effect because Rescue Rabbit is in spell speed 2. If I had Wind Up Rabbit on the board and my opponent had King Tiger Wangu and I summon Wind Up Rabbit and King Tiger Wangu's effect triggers, then I can chain Wind Up Rabbit and activate its effect, target itself, and remove it before it gets destroyed because it's a spell speed 2. However, since Rescue Rabbit isn't spell speed 2, I can't chain it to this trigger, and this will remove my priority. However, when a monster's effect is activated in response to its summoning and triggers as well, I can actually trigger it, chain it to that. So for example, Tour Guide, Since these both happen when it's summoned, King Tiger Wango's effect will trigger because it's mandatory, and I think the way they rule it is mandatory effects will trigger first, and then optional effects will chain after that. So what will happen is if I summon Tour Guide, while King Tiger Wango is face up on the board, then King Tiger Wango's effect will trigger, and then I can chain my Tour Guide's effect. And what will happen is the chain will resolve backwards, so Tour Guide will resolve, I'll get out Sengen, for example, and then King Tiger Wango's effect will resolve and destroy Tour Guide, and then King Tiger Wango will then trigger to Sengen and destroy it as well, because it's a mandatory effect that has to happen when a monster is special summoned, so it won't just skip over Sengen, it'll still respond to Sengen. And then it'll remove the Sengen as well, but then at least I can get my Sengen's effect as well. Whereas something like Rescue Rabbit, I just don't get its effect at all, it just gets sent to the graveyard. So that's how priority works, and in an example of what cards actually remove priority, because this will actually remove, Synchro Monster's priority, like Scrap Dragon will get priority. However, if this is summoned and I summon this will trigger, and this will trigger. And then if I bottomless their Trish, they'll still get the Trishless effect because this is a trigger ability that they have a chance to activate because it's a trigger that happened when it's summoned. So in this example, we'll be talking about how a player gets priority when they enter a phase before their opponent can activate something. So in this example, my opponent has activated Mind Crush during my standby phase and has declared Tour Guide from the Underworld. So I discard my Tour Guide. They saw my hand, and they saw that I had Dark Hole in hand. So then I go to enter my main phase 1, and right when I enter my main phase 1, they say activate Formulous Effect. And they say, do you wish to chain anything? And I say, hold on. I wish to retain priority as turn player, and I'm going to activate Dark Hole. Do you wish to respond to my Dark Hole? And they say, what? No, it's Formula Spell Speed 2. Well, we can just say, hey, we'll call an admin, or if you're at a regionals or YCS or something, then you can just call over a judge. And this is actually perfectly a perfect example of turn priority. This is really important because a lot of players would not really know this. So if you're on this end of the table and you do this, and your opponent says, well, I'm going to retain priority and do Dark Hole, then you know they're not cheating you at least. And if you're on this end and you do this, and then your opponent doesn't catch it, then hey, you got away with it. However, if you're on this end where you're playing the Dark Hole, and your opponent does this, you might not even know that as a player, you get priority, and your opponent's not going to tell you. So this is actually a good example of how priority can actually cost you the game. For example, if my life points here were 24 or 25 or 26 even. Okay, so in this next example, I have drawn my card for my draw phase, and then after I draw, my opponent activates Trap Dust Shoot, and I don't want to lose my Rescue Rabbit, so I kind of pull a dick move, and I say, well, I call priority, or I retain priority during my turn, and I'm gonna discard Max C and activate its effect, because I have priority to activate something before you do. And this is perfectly illegal, so then what will happen is I discard Max C and they cannot chain Trap Dust Shoot because I only have 3 cards in hand at this point. So basically, if they try to activate that, that'd be an illegal activation. And this is perfectly legal. If a judge gets called over, you can just say, well, I retain priority during my turn, so I'm going to discard Max C. On this side, if you're on this side of the table, the way to get around this is you just would say, you would just say, tell me before you enter your main phase 1, or something along those lines, and then so I go, standby phase, main phase 1, and then they go Trap Dust Shoot, and you say, well, I'm going to call priority, and you say, no, you obviously didn't, and when you pass priority during your standby phase, I'm going to activate Trap Dust Shoot. And then if a judge is called over, or for example on DN, if an admin's called over, this would most likely go in their favor, because, or if you're on this side, it would go in your favor, because the person's already in their main phase 1, so they obviously cannot call priority. So that's an example of turn priority and how to retain priority properly. If you're on this side, you can discard Max C, and if you're on this side, how to play around it. In this example, my Rescue Rabbit had gotten removed my previous turn by Future Visions, and this is a trigger effect that says when a monster is summoned, it removes it from play and then returns it the next standby phase. And that removes priority, as we talked about before, because it's the trigger effect that happens when the monster is summoned. So I couldn't call priority with my Rescue Rabbit my last turn. So in this standby phase now, I special summon or not special summon, but I return it. I just return it to that side. So I just return next standby phase, And then I entered my main phase 1, and when I entered my main phase 1, my opponent discarded Effect Veiler and targeted my Rescue Rabbit. And so what I did was, when I entered my main phase 1, I said, when this happened, I said, well, I'm going to retain priority, and I'm going to activate Rescue Rabbit's effect when I enter my main phase 1. Therefore, you cannot activate your Veiler's effect, because at activation of my Rescue Rabbit's effect, there's nothing on the field, so there's nothing for you to activate Effect Veiler on, so that's an illegal activation. And I was like, did you want me to call over an admin so that you don't think I'm cheating you? And he kind of said LOL or something, and was like, oh no, I know how priority works. I was just doing that. And it kind of showed, like he knew how priority worked, but he wasn't sure if I knew how priority worked. And it was a good move on his part, because a lot of players don't know how priority works. So it was good that he did that, because then at that point I went Rescue Rabbit into Logia, and then the duel kind of went downhill from there, and I ended up winning. So, okay, and that's it for priority. So, Channel MST signing off.